Hello. So far, we talked about variance analysis for direct material, direct labor, and we have not touched overhead yet. And in today's class, I plan to talk about analyzing overhead and in specific analyzing the variances of overhead. However, overhead is a little bit different from direct material and the direct labor in that for direct material and direct labor, we can easily track uh, for each unit of products how much material, no matter how many material, how many different kinds of materials this product use. For each product, we can figure out how many in total the materials we need and how much they are, and we can figure out the overall price for each unit of all the materials. And for labor, it is the same. If you look at the finished goods, it's always not too difficult to know that how many labor hours are required to finish the products and how many people, how many different people and labor with different wage the product is from. And we can always figure out for each product the overall combined price of the labor for this product. And then if we look at overhead, well, why we look at overhead again? When we talk about total costs, we decompose total costs into direct labor, direct material, and overhead. So since we talk about material and labor, which are easier to analyze, this time it's time to talk about overhead. But overhead is a little more complicated. Overhead can be of different things. First, we know in overhead there's variable overhead and fixed overhead. Fixed overhead is not too difficult because no matter how many different kinds of overhead there is, as long as it's fixed, we can always figure out. But for variable overhead, there were a few issues. One, when we say variable overhead, it's not necessary that the overhead will vary on a product basis. They might be varying with other factors like labor hours, like machine hours, and there might be different variable overheads varying with different factors, drivers within one product. So it is important for us to really analyze based on each individual variable overhead. In the book, for the sake of simplicity, we just assume there's one variable overhead implicitly, but we have to realize in real world, if you're really looking at a product that you want to analyze overhead or variable overhead in specific, you have to differentiate between different kind of variable overheads, identify their drivers individually, and analyze individually before you're combining the results together. All right, so that's the importance. And also, if you recall what we talked about in last class, we understand that budgets has to be flexible instead of static. Or if you like, you can call dynamic instead of being static. The official word should be flexible budgets. And why it is important? It's important especially for the cost part. Think about it. For sales, if you set a target, for example, I want to sell 1 million units or achieve 1 million sales, then the better, the more sales achieved, the better the performance is. And the salespeople always have the incentive to sell more. However, if your budget is static, what do we mean by static? Static meaning that our goal is only production based on 1 million units. Then for this 1 million units, the cost budget, production budget will specify how many, what's the usage of direct material, what's the usage of direct labor, what's the usage of overhead, and what's the total cost for those different components. It's based on that, based on 1 million units, let's say. However, if salespeople sells more, inevitably, production people will know if they sell more, and we will use more than budgeted. There will be more material used, there will be more labor used, there will be more overhead used. However, if the standard costing, if the standard direct material, the standard cost of direct labor and overhead is based on 1 million units, then it's not good for us because the more you sell, the more unfavorable our cost will be, and we will not be in favor of the boss, and our review will really be screwed up. So production people might just say, okay, you know what? Although you sell more, we cannot produce, we cannot provide you with enough products. We like to stick with 1 million, or worse, they want to produce less, because if they produce fewer than 1 million, then for sure the cost will be lower and they might be viewed in being favorable as well. So it is really important to have a flexible budget, especially for the costs. And what do we mean by flexible budget? Meaning that, again, we know the standard cost or usage of raw material and the labor and overhead per product. And then the total standard cost should be based on how many units produced, really produced. For example, 1 million, we said plan to sell 1 million, but they sold 2 million. So we know that the standard usage of raw material, labor, and overhead should be based on 2 million instead of 1 million. So budgets should be flexible. Keep that in mind. Let's first analyze variable overhead. What is variable overhead variance? Variable overhead is very much like direct material and the direct labor we talked about, as long as we figure out what's the driver for the overhead. Like I said, it's very likely not, it's unlikely to be the product units of production that we talked about. It might be machine hour, labor hour, or some other factors, or may even be quantity of raw material used, for example. So it's really in the sense that a variable overhead in the book content has a variable rate. So it's very much looking like direct material and direct labor, but it is very different in the sense that they don't necessarily vary with number of products. You need to identify drivers. Fortunately, in the book, they will be the drivers will be provided to you, but in real world, I think identify the drivers and figuring out how drivers vary with overhead, variable overhead, is going to be the big bucks paying project of you. So let's take a look at the overhead, okay? For variable overhead, we have standard rate for variable overhead per unit of cost driver that drives variable overhead. And we also have standard quantity of cost driver to be used to produce 1 unit. So it's very much like direct material, if you recall. And then standard quantity per unit overhead multiplied with standard rate give you standard cost of variable overhead per unit of output, or per driver, okay? Output is not very accurate here, sorry about that. And the actual variable overhead is actual rate for overhead, actual quantity of cost driver. Cost driver is better than, I think had some typo there. And we define standard variable overhead cost to be actual for actual production. Is a standard rate of variable overhead multiplied with standard quantity of cost drivers allowed for actual output, and that's applied variable overhead. So here again, when we talk about overall variance, it's the actual rate multiplied with actual quantity for all the production, subtract the product of standard rate and a standard quantity for the actual production. Actual, that's a keyword here. And we do the same thing. We can put the overhead into 2 parts. First part is a difference between actual rate and standard rate multiplied with actual quantity. This is the variance from overhead rate. We call it spending variance. If actual rate is higher than standard rate, it'll be positive, which meaning that actually they spend more, which is not good for sure. But again, it's a price issue, not a quantity, not an efficiency issue, not a volume issue. So here's the first part. And the second part is the multiplication between of SR and the difference between AQ and SQ. So if actually they use too many and more than planned, than standard, then it's going to be positive again. It's not good. Okay, so we call it, this is a variance from quantity used, and we call it volume variance. So let's take a look, do some practice. So here, let's take a look at this. Standard variable overhead rate per direct labor hour is $3.70. Actual variable overhead cost is 206,816. Actual direct labor hours worked is 56,200. And the actual production in units is 14,000. Standard hours allowed for actual units produced is 56,000. So calculate total variance overhead, total overhead variance, variable overhead variance, variable overhead spending, and volume variances. So to do this, we need a few things. What do we need? We need actual rate of overheads. We need actual quantity of variable overhead. We need the standard rate of variable overhead, and we need the the standard quantity of variable overhead. And let's see what information we have in place already. Standard variable overhead rate per direct labor hour. This is a standard rate given to us already, $3.70. And actual variable overhead cost. So actual cost is 206,816. That's the actual cost. And we have the actual labor hours already. So based on these, we know the actual rate, which is just dividing the actual variable overhead costs by the actual direct labor hours worked. So 206,816 divided by 56,200. Okay, it's slightly lower than planned, so which is slightly better at least. And what is actual quantity again? Actual quantity, we have it already, 56,200. That's hours. And the standard quantity allowed is 56. Uh-oh, it seems actual is a little bit higher than standard. So let's do some analysis. So first, spending. When we talk about spending variance, it's always related to the price, right? So if you recall, it's going to be in parentheses, it's going to be actual rate subtract standard rate multiply with actual quantity. That's a spending variance we talk about, and we can see that actual rate is this $3.68. Standard rate is $3.70, and the difference between these will be multiplied with actual quantity, which is 56,200. So here it is 1124 for spending variance. But keep in mind, it's not negative 1,124. It is 1,124 spending variance that is favorable. Why we call it favorable? Because again, it's negative, meaning that at least look at the spending variance, it's saving the company's money. So it's favorable. The variance is still 1,124. So what is efficiency variance? Efficiency variance based on how many material we use compared to what is supposed to be used. So for efficiency, what we do is we have actual quantity, subtract standard quantity, and multiply with standard rate. So again, what is actual quantity again? Actual quantity 56,200, and standard quantity is 56,000, and the difference will be multiplied with standard rate, which is $3.70, and it gives us 740 because it's positive. So we know the variance is 740, and it's unfavorable. Why unfavorable? If you look at this, you know that actual quantity is a little bit higher than standard quantity. We mean that they spend too much anyway. They used it too much, so it's unfavorable. So with the knowledge of spending variance and efficiency variance, we know the total variance is just the sum of the two. So the sum is 384 with a negative sign. What does it mean? It means overall the variance is favorable. Overall they spend less. So this is for variable overheads, and we all know that we still have to worry about fixed overhead, fixed variable overhead. So for fixed variable overhead, it seems improper to still apply try to get a rate. Why? Because fixed overhead, by definition, the total amount don't change. While when the production, when the production kind of becomes production varies, the per unit per product overhead, fixed overhead will vary. So it's a little bit different, right? But we know the budget total companies, when they do this, they have to come up with budgeted overhead, total fixed overhead first, and then they have to figure out, hey, how do we allocate our fixed overhead? What's the driver for our fixed overhead? Is it outputs, or machine hours, or whatever stuff? Because although it is very different from variable overhead and the direct labor, direct material, which they all have a per unit constant per unit or per output cost. I mean, we said fixed overhead, the total don't change, right? However, for fixed overhead, we still have to figure out the allocation base. What is allocation base again? For example, if we talk about machine depreciation, if we talk about how many machine hours, we have to figure out per month or per week. What's the longest time we can keep a machine open during operation hours? And it's understandable because, for example, if you have a rent a warehouse, it's not about project. If you rent a warehouse and then you have the idea of what's the maximum capacity to store stuff, so you have something to start with, right? And in this sense, we can figure out what is predetermined fixed overhead rate. Again, is very, very different from variable overhead rate or direct material rates or direct labor rates. We'll see that in the following slides. And this rate is defined as budgeted fixed overhead divided by practical capacity of allocation base. So if you look at this, we know that the variance again is going to be between actual fixed overhead and the standard applied fixed overhead. What is standard applied overhead? We figure out the standard rates of fixed overhead and then multiply with actual cost driver activities. Again, this is more consistent with flexible budgeting because, for example, if you have a warehouse that able to store 1,000 units, however, if you figure out you will constantly have about 1,500 in stock, then you might need to lease one more. So it's going to double your overhead. Can we see that? And use fixed overhead from this perspective. But this is because you have actual more cost drivers in this. So it's really important. If we just compare the budget, it's unfair because budget is static. Budget is based on what's planned, not what really happened. Standard fixed overhead adjusts, although it's used predetermined standard rate, but it's based on the actual cost drivers. So comparing by this is better. And then we break this comparison into two parts. One is comparing the actual fixed overhead to budgeted fixed overhead. And the second part is compare budgeted overhead to standard fixed overhead. So this one compares to a static budget, tells you, hey, actually whether we spend more or less. It gives you an idea that compared to the forehand plan, whether we did more. And then it gives you the idea of why we have differences. Is it because we did bad, or is it because we have more cost drivers? If we have more cost drivers than planned, then this is still a good thing because this part will for sure be negative, which means variance, favorable variance as well, okay? So let's take a look at a practice and see what we can do about it. So Rostand Incorporated operates a delivery service for over 70 restaurants. The corporation has a fleet of vehicles and has invested in a sophisticated computerized communication system to coordinate its deliveries. Rostand has gathered the following actual data on last year's delivery operation. Deliveries made 38,600. Direct labor 31,000 direct labor hours at $40 per hour. Actual variable overhead was 157,700. Rostand employs a standard costing system. During the year, a variable overhead rate of $5.10 per hour was used. The labor standard requires 80 cents hour per delivery. Assuming that the actual fixed overhead was 403,400, budgeted fixed overhead was 400,000, and based on the practical capacity of 32,000 direct labor hours. Okay, so let's take a look. Again, don't be lazy when we do calculation. I think it's always a good idea to figure out, right? So what do we need for this? We need actual fixed overheads, and we need budget fixed overhead, and we need standard fixed overhead. All right. So let's first talk about actual fixed overhead. What's our actual fixed overhead? It's 403, 400 here. And what is our budgeted overhead? Budgeted overhead is fairly easy, right? Budgeted overhead is 400,000, again, which has been told us. So we have the first part here. We have this called a so we have the fixed overhead spending variance already, which is here, compared to budget, whether we spend too much or not. So we're gonna talk about the volume later. And how do we determine standard overhead, standard fixed overhead? We need two things, right? We need a standard rate and actual drivers. Actual drivers, number of drivers, okay? Not the car drivers. So what is our standard rate again? Standard rate is defined as the, keep in mind, standard rate is, I'll just show you, it's difficult to type. What is standard rate again? Standard rate, so standard fixed overhead is a standard multiplication of standard rate and actual cost driver activity, and standard rate equals budgeted fixed overhead and divided by practical capacity of allocation base. So what is our budgeted overhead again? Our budgeted fixed overhead is 400,000 there, and all we need is practical capacity of allocation base. And what is capacity of allocation base? It is 32,000. Okay, so standard rate is 400,000 divided by 32,000. So the standard rate of overhead was, the standard rate was $13, okay, was $13. So standard rate is $12.50. What is the standard number of drivers we need? We need for the actual deliveries. You can see it's based on the variable fixed overhead. It's based on delivery, right? So the company made deliveries in the amount of 38,600, and based on their expectation, each delivery should require 0.8 hours. Sorry, here it should, I put the name wrong. It should not be standard drivers, number of drivers. So we know that, okay, so the company made 38,600 deliveries, and each delivery should cost 0.8 hours as pointed here. So the total hours supposed to be used based on the actual deliveries made, the total cost, the total fixed cost based on the actual deliveries made should be standard rate multiplied with standard hours, which give you 386,000. So we have spending variance and volume variance here. And what is spending variance? Quite straightforward. Difference between actual fixed overhead and budget fixed overhead. It's 3,400. It's positive, so it's unfavorable. And what is volume overhead we talk about? Volume overhead is a difference between the subtracting standard fixed overhead from budgeted fixed overhead. It is 14,000. It is again unfavorable. And the total variance is going to be 17,400 for fixed overhead. All right, that's all for today.